Here we are with Colin Foster, who's been a councillor for quite a long time, one way or another. No doubt tell us about the early days and also later on. But Colin, let's hear from you about when you were, I think, on the county borough or whatever it was, or just before that anyway.
I was first elected in 1972 for the Lancashire Hill ward for the then Stockport County Borough. That only lasted until 1974 when the new Stockport Metropolitan Borough Authority was created. Those days in the Labour Party were radically different to what they are today. For example, the Stockport District Committee, or Central Party as it was also known, was extremely powerful, and the constituencies didn't really meet. The role of the trade unions was very, very strong, particularly that of the AUEW. In that period there were all sorts of conflicts that went on, which were both from within the council and without. The first major one that I can recall was in relation to the follow-up of the 1970 general election, when Arnold Gregory, who had held the seat, was nominated by all the wards, and when it came to the selection meeting he had withdrawn because of various pressures that appear to have been put in the background. We went to a selection process which ended up with a compromise candidate of somebody who was a Methodist vicar from Marple. The AUEW delegates were after a person called Machin, I think was from Sheffield. However, at the end of the meeting we were declared we weren't in favour of the process that had taken place, and ended up having a full national executive inquiry into what had happened, who in turn then declared the ballot null and void, and a new selection process was undertaken, which ended up with Andrew Bennett being the candidate selected for the Stockport constituency.
Okay, Colin, well, what happened after that? I suppose the rest is history almost.
Well, Andrew Bennett then stood, and the Idris Owen, the Tory MP that won in 1970, was defeated in February 1974. The beauty of being in control, as we were at that point, enabled the election campaign to have, for example, lots of posters all on the street lampposts, which, excuse me Peter, I'm about to sneeze.
Oh.
Can I just go back?
Yeah, okay. Start again.
Andrew Bennett was the candidate for February 1974 with the fallout from the miners' strike. Idris Owen was the MP, Tory MP that had been selected in elected in 1970. He was defeated by about 250, but being in control of Stockport County Borough, we were able to have, in an unprecedented way, all of our posters on many of the street lamps on the main routes such as Lancashire Hill, Wellington Road North and so on, very much to the chagrin of the opposition. And we went on in October to make that an even greater majority, and as you may be aware, Andrew continued right through until 2005 as a Member of Parliament. At that time there were all sorts of other things going on. In 1972 there was the infamous Housing Finance Act, which led to a split in the Labour group, where some wanted it to be implemented and some didn't. This is in the context of one small place in North Derbyshire called Claycross that eventually led to all the councillors being debarred, amongst them many of the brothers of Dennis Skinner. In Stockport that led to a by-election with the deputy leader resigning, and we had a by-election which was fought in November in a very cold and difficult way, but won easily. But this was all a prelude to the 1973 period, when elections were to take place for the Greater Manchester Council and for the new Metropolitan Borough. Just prior to that, as a spillover from that Housing Finance Act split in Stockport, there was an attempt to have all of the people within the Labour group, such as myself, Andy Vidai, a whole list of us, to be selected for places like Wilmslow. However, I was constituency secretary at that time, as was Arthur Bradbury, and I think it was Colin Campbell for the Cheadle Hazel Grove constituency, and we made sure that it was selected in a proper manner, i.e. the most winnable wards were selected first of all, and so that particular problem was sorted out. Post the 1973-74 elections, we moved from being in overall control to one where in the new borough with Bramall's and the Cheadles, that we were the opposition, but the Conservatives were in control eventually, although for 1 year they were in minority control. There were many different things that went on, a lot of hard work in that period to actually establish the new borough. Many people fell by the wayside with Labour being in control. We lost seats, Tories gained control, and it was an interesting period. I actually retired in 1980 for family reasons, with having two children at 6 and 3. But I didn't actually give up on the Labour Party. In fact, I switched over to being a very active member of Stockport constituency. Prior to that, I had been involved in the early 70s of moving the constituency from a non-entity into one where the constituency started to become very active, and post to 1974 the constituency was in actual fact the central unit of how things operated in our area in Stockport.
I think Harold Wilson did that, didn't he? Because they decided in the Labour Party nationally that constituencies were more important than local government, and so the constituencies became the principal unit. At least that's my impression of that time.
I don't recall who it was, but certainly that is exactly what happened, from a very strong central party that was heavily dominated by the trade unions, with constituencies effectively being moribund, to one where in the new borough we had a new type of district party, but that was a unit in its own right, but the constituencies were freestanding and continued through to today as being the most preeminent party unit within the area.
Yes, start up again. You carry on with your story then. Okay.
When the Labour Party split in the early 80s, those of us in the then Stockport North constituency were not directly affected because there was little impact on us locally within Stockport North. However, Stockport South had an MP called Tom McNally, whose previous history was a little bit dubious, and some of us who'd been involved in the National Union of Students in the 60s knew about his close affinity with the various agencies connected with the Americans and the CIA. However, he was adopted, he did become a Labour MP, but in 1981-82 he defected to the newly created SDP. The distinction between Stockport North and Stockport South also ended because for the 1983 general election, all the constituencies were reorganised. Andrew Bennett moved to become the Denton Reddish MP, and what was now the new Stockport constituency that had previously been represented by McNally, there was a candidate came in and I think he was a trade union official, and
His name was Peter Ward.
Peter Ward. He was the candidate for the then Stockport South to replace McNally, but we got defeated quite heavily. But that was as a part of the swing nationally, and also the move away from two Stockport constituencies, one of which, Stockport South, was fairly strong Labour, and Stockport North, which was marginal, to one which was the new Stockport constituency, was a marginal constituency. Following on from that, there was a large number of disputes in the constituency in the mid-80s, with the rise of militant and other types of far-left groups, entryist groups in the Labour Party. And in 1985, despite what some of us said and thought and tried to do, a candidate called Kath Crosbie was adopted, who responded to a question asked at the selection meeting whether she had anything in her history that could be brought against her, and she said that she was proud that she had been a council house tenant who, like every council house tenant, had a lot of arrears on her rent.
I seem to remember, didn't she own a house as well at the same time, or something like that?
She had lived in Manchester, it turned out, had left Manchester with a whole string of debts. She'd lived in Moss Side, that's where the council house debts were actually related to originally, and had moved down to London, and she had a number of High Court orders against her for debt. This had not been made available to the constituency when it was actually making its decisions in relation to who the candidate would be. But after several months of this information coming out, Kath Crosbie resigned, probably before the constituency took action to actually take the candidature away from her.
I seem to remember a visit from somebody who's really well known, Robin Cook.
It was Robin Cook.
Yes, who said get rid of her.
It was the weekend of when Robin Cook came to Bennington Labour Club, and we were having a ceilidh, and it was at that point it emerged that she had resigned, and thank goodness. Candidates should not be of that particular type of individual. It was also the end, or the beginning of the end, of the infiltration into the constituency, because the constituency was brought into line as using ordinary standing orders, the national standing orders, proper representation taking place, and consequent to that, it meant that these various organisations withered away as their influence equally was thwarted.
Hang on a moment while I read all of the 1980s and so forth. You start from there, please.
Sorry, Peter, you mean from the party organisation?
Yes, so we talk about the party organisation, build up in Heaton, Mersey and so forth, in the 1990 election.
In Heaton, Mersey, we built up a very large membership, and we also changed our approach so that instead of the traditional campaigning only taking place at election times, we were campaigning on local issues in a small way prior to that 1990 election over about 3 or 4 years. We'd done a little bit of that in Reddish in the 1970s, and we'd done some more about membership as well, but it was nothing in comparison to where we were in 1990. Having made the breakthrough of getting in a Labour Council in 1990, we then set about organising ourselves with newsletters, with weekly walkabouts, and though these have changed in nature, we have consistently for the last 21 years, week in, week out, actually been out on the knocker talking to the local electorate. That has paid dividends in that we won all the Heaton Mersey seats by 1995 and the Heaton Moor seats by 1996. We retained the Heaton Mersey ones although the Tories were able to get an odd one in through particular local difficulties we had, as well as there being a Labour government, which obviously is always a problem when you have you're in power.
Okay, right, far away.
Having been heavily defeated in 1987, we set about to build our organisation across Stockport constituency. We adopted Anne Coffey as our candidate, and in 1992 we were able to defeat the Tories. Unfortunately, and on a national scale, we weren't able to replicate that. However, it was an important springboard. When 1997 general election came, there was a great deal of work did go on, but with the addition of Brinnington, the Stockport constituency did become much safer consequently. We twinned up with High Peak, and we moved from a situation that we'd experienced in the 80s and in 1992, when we were a marginal constituency, when we had a high level of organisation, lots of activity going on with literally hundreds of people coming in from outside, big central committee rooms, lots of target letters going out. We moved by 1997 to where we were a safe seat, and therefore organisation has had to reflect that. We twinned up with High Peak, and we actually sent, for example, on election night, upwards of 10 to 15 cars over to Glossop as a part of their campaign. Coming back to Stockport for the count, and then going on to Brinnington Labour Club, was a most moving experience, actually seeing members who had been members of the Labour Party for many, many years, and actually seeing a Labour government coming back in again.
Yeah. How things have gone on since then, right up to now, in fact, if you like, and then we can do the hung council and that bit after that.
I was treasurer for Stockport Labour Party for the 97 general election, and subsequently I have been involved as vice chair and more latterly as agent over the last 13, 14 years. As has happened across most of the country, the party organisation has got weaker. However, we have laid a great emphasis as our policy across the whole of Stockport constituency for local campaigning, and working with the group, we have actually regularly now produced ward leaflets 4 times a year, and albeit that we have been very weak in a couple of wards, those now in 2011 are fully functioning and are extremely active. General elections now are entirely different than they were either when you were a marginal constituency or even the way in which things have changed. In the 2010 general election, partly because it was run at the same time as the local government elections, we ran local campaigns with the MP working in conjunction with that, but we also had central leaflets that were put out through the post office, and that was our main campaign for the local election, for the elections, and that paid dividends eventually. The party organisation is still very much branch/ward based. The role of the trade unions over the years has become less and less, and I think really the change point would be around about 1990, because thereafter there has been continued union involvement. However, the role of other unions, particularly the AUEW, which 40 years ago were very, very strong in Stockport, to the extent now there are very few activists involved with what's going on in the Labour Party.
Yes. Okay, we can perhaps now, Colin, we can perhaps talk about the time when the council was hung, and we managed to get a few things done now, unlike what happens nowadays. Everything gets voted out completely, doesn't it?
I was not on council in the mid-80s, albeit that I was an advisor on the Education Committee from 1984 to 88. However, Stockport Council moved from being Tory overall control in about 1984-85
That's right.
to one where the Tories progressively lost seats. Labour and Liberals were both beneficiaries of this, but the Liberals to a greater extent than Labour was. To the extent that by the mid-90s there were only 2 Conservative councillors. Throughout the period from about 1986-87 onwards, the Lib Dems were the larger group, and they eventually, in 99-2000, became the group with overall control. From about 1990, when the Labour numbers were swelling and the Liberals were also increasing to the extent that we had, by about 1995, 27 Labour councillors out of 63, we were able to not so much do deals, but actually sort out a lot of problems and issues that ensured that the areas that we represented were well represented in terms of proposals coming forward and so on. There was also a great deal of debate went on as a consequence of that, rather than the very much sterile atmosphere that we currently have, where you have one group that is in total control and it doesn't listen to anything of the opposition.
Yeah. Okay, tell us about scrutiny then.
In 2001, the Labour government changed the whole traditional basis that local government was, democracy in local government was actually run, moving away from the traditional committees onto what was called an executive and scrutiny process. This was because, according to the government, decision making was taking so long and going through so many committees and subcommittees and held up for this, that and the other, that there had to be an increase in efficiency of decision making. In the early days when scrutiny was introduced in 2001, the controlling group, which in those days was and still is the Lib Dems, they took over what were called the executive posts, and either as individuals or as meeting together as the executive, they would make decisions. Those decisions could in actual fact be reviewed either in advance or prior to the decision being made by the scrutiny committees, and scrutiny committees could also look at the activities of the council, what progress was being made, and also undertake policy reviews. Over the last 4 years, the role of scrutiny has been completely minimised with the way the Lib Dems operate in Stockport. There has been no will to actually involve scrutiny in decision making. The first 5 years or so, it was a matter of principle that any report going to the executive would largely go to scrutiny for their consideration. Nowadays, few, if any, actually go to the scrutiny committees, so it leaves the scrutiny committees as being almost like eunuchs.
Yes, that's right. Anything else then, Colin, that your memories of the party and what went on in politics locally?
I think some of the involvement of the general public in things has dramatically altered. If you take parallel to the Labour Party, in 1968 there was a very famous industrial conflict in Stockport called the Roberts Arundel Affair, which was when an American company refused to recognise the union and caused a national conflict. That hung over Stockport and its history for a number of years, both in a negative way and a positive way. The negative way being everything was backtracked to where people's positions were in 1968, but more positively it meant that there was a whole grouping of people within the Labour Party who wanted to work together to make sure that things happened. And that continued, and that's not just on a local basis, on a national basis. After the 79 general election, with the massive cuts that the Thatcher government were carrying out in 1980-81, there were a series of demonstrations across the country against unemployment. I recall going over to Liverpool on one of the buses that Stockport Labour Party organised, and I think there were 15 double-decker buses went from Stockport over to Liverpool, plus many people under their own steam, and there was over 500,000 people on that demonstration. Equally, a few months later, going down to the Birmingham March, I think there was about 60,000 people on that. Compare that with today, that is not the kind of political activity that we see in our country on actions like that. I know that there was the anti-Iraq war demonstration, but that was a one-off. There's not been massive marches like that since. Probably the early 80s marches were a hangover of what used to happen in the 1960s with anti-Vietnam demonstrations, when you get 100,000, 200,000 people in London without even having to organise much on it. And the whole of our political culture has completely altered in the last 40 years, sometimes for the good, but in other times very much for the worse, in terms of people not wanting to be involved in things, even though it's directly affecting themselves.
That's interesting, because the march made to the town hall the other night over the cuts being made this time, £20 million worth of cuts, only 150 people joined a march up from Mersey Square to the town hall to lobby the councillors. Although we have had some fairly big rallies in London, of course, and other towns over tuition fees and things like that. Do you think things might be coming back a little bit there?
I think there is a re-emergence. It's likely to be in a different way. Certainly, the present government's big bang approach of taking on everything at the same time, unlike the Thatcher government, which was very careful what its proposals were. It took one target at a time, whether it was the miners, whether it was the trade unions, whether it was privatisation. It would move step by step. This government has gone on a big bang approach, and consequently is taking on many sets of people across the country, and therefore the responses may very well begin to be showing itself with things like demonstrations. But people are more likely to use social media, more likely to go on television, more likely to write to the newspapers than they used to in the past. There's a lot more individual action taking place rather than mass action taking place.
We like to talk about. Colin, that leads us neatly into what your hopes are for the future, because I think there is a future for us, isn't there?
The future very much depends on how the Labour Party locally and nationally reflects the national mood. Labour has always been the party of working people, the party of those who are against those who have privileges. We now have a society that's highly divided, and if the Labour Party nationally and in all localities goes back to its roots, does work with local residents and working people, it will build back what used to be the natural alliances that took place. All those alliances nowadays are going to be completely different. The alliances are likely to be with students, with young people, with residents groups, rather than traditionally that were through the trade unions.
Right. Yes, Colin, I think you wanted to tell me about what's happening on the social side. We had quite a successful event last week, didn't we?
Yes, we did. I think we should, if we go back over the 40 years, we see the changing nature of these events. Up until 1970, the Labour Party had its own club in the heart of Stockport, which was sold for development, and eventually we got our own club in the 80s at Wellington Road North, there have been all sorts of events that the Labour Party used to get involved with, and that kind of in the 90s and early part of the millennium had virtually run out. And it wasn't just with lack of people, it was just the change in which social events we had. For example, for about 15 years, regular Cayleys that Andrew Bennett was able to sponsor. We had in the early 70s an extremely active young socialist group who were in themselves at a hall that we used to have in South Reddish called the Nook. We had all sorts of events going on. We regularly used to have fundraising events like stop it.
Okay, start again.
We regularly used to have events such as jumble sales to raise funds. We were able to have a whole string of major speakers that would come to the constituency that we were able to build either fundraising or social events around. That has largely disappeared. However, there are now, partly because of more people becoming active, but also the recognition that being a party member is not just either attending meetings or delivering leaflets. It is also that you have friendships and you meet and you have various activities, albeit it may not be at the Labour Club, it could be events outside, but having social activities is now re-emerging as quite an important side to the Labour Party within Stockport.
Yeah. Hi. I'm not, but I'm doing it.
If I was all doing it, so they get a different angle. So, Councillor Scott.